Imagine a massive, sharpened blade of cold steel suspended high above a city square, gleaming under the pale morning sun of Paris. Below it sits a man who, only a few years prior, was believed to be the living representative of God on earth. He is Louis XVI, the King of France, but in this moment, he is simply citizen Louis Capet. As the heavy blade drops with a sickening metallic thud, a 1,000-year-old dynasty is severed in a single second. The crowd doesn't just cheer. They rush forward to dip their handkerchiefs in the blue blood of royalty. A ritualistic act of defiance that signaled the end of the old world. But here is the terrifying reality that history often skims over. The execution of the king wasn't the end of the violence. It was merely the opening act for a machinery of slaughter that would eventually turn on the very people who built it. This was the Reign of Terror, a period where a quest for total liberty transformed into a system of total paranoia, proving that when an empire collapses, the vacuum it leaves behind is often filled by something far more dangerous than the tyranny it replaced. In this investigation, we are going inside the gilded halls of Versailles and the blood-soaked streets of Paris to uncover the true machinery behind the French Revolution's descent into madness. We will explore how a shy, indecisive king and a misunderstood queen became the ultimate targets of a propaganda machine that could no longer be stopped. We will look at the secret committees, the law of suspects, and the psychological profile of Maximilien Robespierre, the man who believed that the only way to create a virtuous republic was through the constant application of the blade. We're going to reconstruct the collapse of the Bourbon monarchy, not as a simple uprising, but as a complex political suicide fueled by debt, hunger, and a radical new ideology that redefined the value of a human life. If you're into stories that peel back the layers of legendary collapses to find the gritty, investigative truth beneath, you've found the right place. Join us as we explore the night the lights went out in the Enlightenment. If you're fascinated by these moments where the world breaks and rebuilds itself in blood, make sure to subscribe so you can join us for our next investigation into the dark history of power. To understand why the French monarchy fell so spectacularly, you have to understand the gilded cage of Versailles. Built by the Sun King Louis XIV, the palace was a masterpiece of political engineering. It wasn't just a home, it was a system designed to strip the French nobility of their independent power by forcing them to live under the king's roof, competing for the honor of holding his candle or dressing him in the morning. For a century, this machinery worked perfectly, keeping the king at the center of the universe. But by the time Louis XVI took the throne in 1774, the machinery was beginning to grind. The palace had become a bubble, a place where the scent of expensive perfume and the sound of chamber music drowned out the distant rumblings of a starving nation. Louis XVI was a man who preferred hunting and locksmithing to the dirty business of statecraft. He was a good man, perhaps, but he was a catastrophic king, ruling an empire that was essentially bankrupt from a century of constant warfare, including a massive, ironic investment in the American Revolution that would eventually provide the ideological blueprint for his own destruction. But here is what most people miss about the months leading up to the collapse. France wasn't just broke, it was hungry. A series of massive crop failures had sent the price of a single loaf of bread to over 80% of a peasant's daily wage. The people didn't just want food, they wanted a voice. When Louis XVI, desperate for money, called the Estates General for the first time in over 100 years, he inadvertently opened a door that he could never close. He expected a discussion on taxes. He got a demand for a total restructuring of society. When he tried to lock the commoners out of the meeting hall, they simply moved to a nearby indoor tennis court and swore an oath that they wouldn't leave until France had a constitution. The invisible throne of absolute monarchy had been challenged, And for the first time in French history, the king blinked. The fall of the Bastille on July 14, 1789, is often remembered as a glorious moment of liberation, but from an investigative standpoint, it was a terrifying breakdown of state control. The Bastille was a symbol of royal tyranny, yes, but it was also a gunpowder magazine. The mob didn't go there for the prisoners. There were only 7 of them. They went there for the weapons. When the fortress fell and the governor's head was paraded on a pike, the machinery of the old regime officially shattered. But the king remained at Versailles, seemingly convinced that this was just a riot rather than a revolution. That delusion ended in October, when a mob of thousands of women driven by the desperation of hunger marched 12 miles from Paris to Versailles. They broke into the palace, nearly killed the queen in her bed, and forced the royal family to return to Paris as hostages of the people. This was the moment the monarchy changed sides. They were no longer the rulers of France. They were the prisoners of a city that was rapidly radicalizing. For 2 years, the king played a double game. He pretended to support the new constitutional monarchy while secretly writing to the other kings of Europe, begging them to invade France and restore his power. This culminated in the flight to Varennes, the most disastrous political move in the history of the Bourbons. In the middle of the night in June 1791, the royal family disguised themselves as servants and fled the city in a heavy, slow-moving carriage. They were heading for the border, where a loyal army was waiting. But they were recognized by a postmaster who compared the king's face to the image on a piece of paper currency. They were caught and dragged back to Paris in a humiliating procession. This was the ultimate betrayal. To the people of France, the king was no longer their little father. He was a traitor who had tried to abandon his children to foreign bayonets. The machinery of the Republic was now fueled by a singular, burning desire for revenge. This is where things get strange. As the war with Austria and Prussia began, and foreign armies threatened to burn Paris to the ground if the king was harmed, the French revolutionaries didn't cower. They leaned into the chaos. A new radical faction, called the Jacobins, led by the fanatical lawyer Maximilien Robespierre, seized control of the narrative. They argued that the king must die so that the country can live. In August 1792, a mob attacked the Tuileries Palace, massacring the king's Swiss guard in one of the most brutal displays of violence the city had ever seen. The monarchy was officially abolished, and the First Republic was born. But this republic wasn't built on the ideals of the Enlightenment. It was built on the Committee of Public Safety, a 12-man dictatorship that viewed any dissent as a death sentence. The Reign of Terror was not a period of lawless rioting. It was a period of state-sponsored, bureaucratic slaughter. Robespierre, a man known as the Incorruptible for his rigid adherence to his principles, believed that virtue without terror is powerless. He created a legal machinery designed to process enemies of the people as quickly as possible. The law of suspects meant that you could be arrested not for what you did, but for what you might think, or even for simply not being enthusiastic enough about the revolution. Neighbors turned on neighbors, and children were encouraged to denounce their parents. The guillotine, originally designed as a humane method of execution, became a factory of death. In Paris alone, over 16,000 people were officially executed, but across France, the number is estimated to be closer to 40,000. Many of them drowned in barges or shot in mass graves in the provinces. One of the most fascinating hypotheses about this period is the psychological profile of the leaders themselves. Robespierre and his right-hand man, Saint-Just, weren't traditional tyrants who wanted wealth or luxury. They lived modest, almost monastic lives. They genuinely believed they were creating a republic of virtue, where everyone would be equal and pure. But they became so obsessed with this vision that they viewed human beings as mere obstacles to be removed. They had created a machinery of fear that was so efficient it eventually became autonomous. By late 1793, even the most famous leaders of the revolution, like Georges Danton, were being sent to the guillotine because they suggested that the terror had gone too far. When Danton was led to the scaffold, he shouted to the crowd, "Robespierre, you will follow me." It was a prophecy that would come true in a matter of months. The collapse of the terror was just as violent as its rise. By the summer of 1794, the members of the Convention, the French Parliament, realized that no one was safe. Robespierre had just announced that he had a new list of traitors within the government, but he refused to name them. This was the breaking point. Realizing that it was either Robespierre's head or theirs, the deputies revolted. On the 9th of Thermidor, they declared Robespierre an outlaw. A frantic battle broke out at the city hall, where Robespierre was found with a shattered jaw, possibly from a failed suicide attempt or a soldier's bullet. The next day, the man who had sent thousands to the blade was himself laid under the guillotine. As the blade fell, the machinery of the terror finally jammed. The people were exhausted. The blood was literally overflowing the gutters of Paris, and the radical dream had turned into a nightmare of exhaustion. But here is the final chilling investigative payoff. The revolution began with a cry for liberty and the end of one-man rule. Yet by 1799, the chaos and the blood of the terror had left the French people so desperate for order that they welcomed a new dictator with open arms, Napoleon Bonaparte. The machinery of the revolution hadn't destroyed absolute power. It had simply streamlined it. Napoleon would take the administrative efficiency created by the Jacobins and use it to build an empire that would dwarf anything the Bourbons had ever dreamed of. The king was dead, the republic was gone, and the emperor was born from the ashes of the guillotine. The rise and collapse of the French monarchy during the Terror is the ultimate cautionary tale about the volatility of power. It shows us that an empire doesn't just fall because of a single riot. It falls because its leaders lose touch with the reality of their people. And it stays fallen because the violence of a revolution often consumes the very ideals it was meant to protect. It leaves us with a reflection that still haunts our political world today. When we tear down the old structures of power, are we prepared for the monsters that might crawl out of the ruins? If this deep dive into the blood and the ideology of the French Revolution changed how you see the path from Versailles to the guillotine, make sure to subscribe so you can join us for our next investigative journey into the dark side of history. The tragedy of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette was that they were the wrong people at the absolute worst moment in history. They were relics of a medieval past trying to survive in a radical future. Their deaths were not just the end of a family, but the end of the belief that some people are born to rule, while others are born to serve. But the terror that followed reminds us that the quest for equality can be just as deadly as the quest for gold if it is not tempered by mercy. As you look at the monuments of Paris today, remember that they were built on a foundation of bone and iron. The shadows of the guillotine still linger over the history of the modern world, asking us if we have truly learned how to govern without the use of fear.